Everybody, thanks for coming today. Wow, what a great turnout. Really excited. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. Pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Today we're meeting on the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Wyatt Vine, and I'm a third-year PhD student at UNSW. And over the past year, I've been participating in SQA as one of the student representatives, and along with the other student reps from University of Sydney, Macquarie, and University of Technology, Sydney. We've been helping organize the SQA seminars, the mini student conference, and tonight's event.
And hi, I'm Biliana. I'm the engagement manager at SQA. I have 25 years experience spanning financial services and tech, so I'm an industry person. And here at SQA, my role is to connect the two, ensure that we are having the right connections, having the right dialogues that then lead to partnerships that are bringing benefits to both parties.
So I'm really excited about today's event. I'm sure all of you can sympathize that when you're a grad student, the question you're asked all the time is, what are you going to do when you finish? And I'm really hoping that tonight can help us figure that out a little bit. I mean, when we submit our PhD thesis, it's a little bit of a crossroads. And it's obviously a simplification, but that crossroads is often framed as a choice between pursuing a career in industry or a career in academia. By the time we finish our PhDs, each of us will have had at least 4 years in a PhD. We'll probably have a pretty good idea of the steps that are required to become an academic, but that doesn't necessarily mean we'll know all of the ins and outs of what a career in academia necessarily entails. So I think it's important that we have conversations with our supervisors about all the nitty-gritty details and get their advice and perspective on that. On the flip side, I don't have any experience working outside of academia. So it's a little bit hard for me to figure out what I would be gaining or maybe giving up if I went down that path. And so to help us answer these questions, I thought what better way than to host an excellent panel and hopefully gain some insights from their own experience and perspective. So we've encouraged all of you attending today to submit questions in advance for the panelists. And in turn, we've asked our panelists to try and answer the questions as if they're having a conversation with one of their own PhD students who is approaching graduation. There will also be time at the end from the audience and also from those on Zoom. So if you're on Zoom and would like to ask a question, please type it into the chat. And for those of you who are attending in person, there will also be a chance to meet with the panelists afterwards. And just a quick reminder that the event is being recorded. So tonight we have absolutely fantastic panel of speakers. I'm really grateful that they all accepted the invitation and came. So really looking forward to hearing their insights and perspective. So on the far right-hand side, we have Professor John Martinis, who is a professor of physics at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And throughout his career, he's been really interested in superconducting qubits. And from 2014 until 2020, he was the leader of Google's quantum computing research group. And we've been lucky enough to have him in Sydney since late last year when he joined Silicon Quantum Computing here at UNSW. Seated next to him is Professor David Reilly, who is the principal researcher and director at Microsoft Station Q in Sydney. And his research focuses on interfacing classical and quantum electronics. And he's also a professor of physics at the University of Sydney and a chief investigator in the ARC Center of Excellence, EQUIS. Seated closest to me is Professor Koy Lam, who is the first to demonstrate end-to-end quantum key distribution. He holds a professorship at the Australian National University in Canberra, is an elected member of the Australian Academy of Science, and is the chief scientist and co-founder of Australia's first quantum technology company, Quintessence Labs. And we're really excited to have Dr. Nicola Pastorello joining us on Zoom. He's currently the data science lead for BlueScope, which is a $9.5 billion steel company based in Melbourne. And prior to BlueScope, he was the AI solutions manager at a venture capital funded tech startup. And he completed his PhD in astrophysics at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne in 2015. And since then, he's been translating his experience in big data and machine learning to business. So to kick off tonight, we thought we'd just start with a general question to each of the panelists in turn to maybe tell us a little bit about how they got involved in academia in the first place, and subsequently, what was your motivation to take up a more industry-focused role, or expand your academia into industry as well? Professor Martinis, would you be willing to start?
Sure, thank you. When I graduated with my PhD, I had not focused on having to be in academia, and I'm the kind of person who liked to be in lab. So after doing my postdoc, I joined a US government research labs called NIST in the United States. And I really enjoyed that because I could go in the lab and do things myself and learn my skills and the like. And that was great for, 15 years or so that I was there. And then kind of at the end, I kind of having to want more freedom to do exactly what I wanted. And then the way that we were raising money at the government lab was getting a little bit difficult. And it just seemed a lot easier to go to academia than to raise money at the government lab. It's a subtle story. So then I went into academia and I enjoyed it very much. I was focusing on quantum computing, funding, a lot of good students, and I very much enjoyed that transition. Enjoyed teaching. That was a challenge, but I enjoyed that quite a lot.
Yeah, so I think similar probably to many people, there was no clear moment in time where I made a decision to enter academia or equivalently industry. I think I left high school without who enrolled in a degree that sounded pretty good, and I was kind of interested in, I think, things like pulling cars apart and working very technical things, but also interested in bigger ideas and mathematics and philosophy. And the description in the handbook in high school sounded good, and that seemed to be what physics was, but it wasn't until I was a few years in I realized, indeed, this is what I like doing. I just didn't know what it was called. So I think that took me through many different opportunities, both in Australia and also in the US. But the transition to industry was largely about the realization that for the field of quantum computing, it was more and more challenging to have genuine impact as a small academic lab. And the support, the funding, the resources, but also the partnerships and the reach. And a particular example, just on my mind, John and I were just talking about controlling qubits with electronics, with CMOS electronics, silicon electronics. And I can remember in 2014, as a professor, trying to contact foundries and get them a little bit interested in the idea that they might start to work with us and collaborate with us and build out circuits. And I really struggled and got nowhere. And I had the realization that you kind of need some industry muscle that's going to create those partnerships and relationships that then opens up a whole world that we can now, harness and leverage. And for me, that was a powerful force to actually jump into this and enable those opportunities.
I was born in Malaysia, did my high school in Singapore and my undergraduate in New Zealand. During my undergraduate, I did physics and maths, and then somehow I just got more and more involved with abstract algebra and Galois theory. And I thought, wow, gee, that's useful. And so I went back to Malaysia and I started working for two really big companies back then, Sony Electronics, where I was a process engineer. And then I later on joined Hewlett-Packard, where I worked on semiconductor LED devices. I spent about 3 years as engineers for these two companies. Then I came to the ANU and finished my postgraduate and my PhD. And I was lucky enough that immediately after graduation, ANU gave me a tenured position. So I worked on quantum optics, and together with my PhD students, we then co-founded Quintessence Labs, which now has an office in Deakin in Canberra and also in San Jose in California. Yeah, so my path is really zigzaggy. But the interesting thing is that when we were working on our quantum key distribution protocols, it turns out that we did have to make use of Galois theory. So that wasn't a complete waste.
Awesome. Can you hear me? There is a bit of echo, but hopefully it's not affecting you. So yeah, as you can guess from my accent and my name, I'm from Italy, and got super into astrophysics very early. When I was in high school, my physics professor there was a graduate in astrophysics, and he sold me this idea of doing the job, the most exciting job in the world. Especially observational astrophysics involves a lot of travel to cool places because telescopes are in Hawaii, in Chile, and I was fascinated by this idea of getting paid for travel and have fun. Reality was a bit harder. When I did my undergrad and master's in Italy, it was a lot of theory and a lot of study, but weirdly enough, I really loved it. After which, I still had the sense that I wanted to travel, and I had the chance to go to the UK for a short gig there as a postgraduate researcher for 3 months, after which Minneapolis for a similar project. But when I was in the UK, I met the guy that eventually turned to be my PhD supervisor, who offered me to come to Melbourne. So from an Italian point of view, it's best than flying all the way across the globe to the opposite side and doing a PhD. And during the PhD, I really loved what I did, and I was really considering about continuing my career in academia. Until I realized that what I loved about astrophysics, especially the travel part, was also not something that you can match with having a stable family. At the time, I just got married, my wife was expecting, and the two alternatives were either I find a job in the country I love the most now in the world, which is Australia, and so abandoning academia, or I have to do, in terms of continuing my career, at least 2 or probably 3 postdocs around the world, because that's how it works, at least in the astrophysics field. And yeah, you can guess what the choice was, given that I'm talking to you from Melbourne. But yeah, so that's about it.
All right, thank you, Nico. I might direct this one to David to start with. How does the everyday work environment in industry compare to the one in academia in terms of, team dynamics, research/project ownership, team structure?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer because, first of all, academic groups are different, and depending whether you're a student or postdoc or university staff or a group leader, your day-to-day is going to be obviously different. And startup companies, medium-scale industries, large companies like Microsoft, it's quite different. I think the other thing to bear in mind, certainly when it comes to industry setting, is the default is not to have a PhD. There are many people in those companies that do not have PhDs. So if you're a PhD entering industry, you're already into a certain, I think, way of working and role that mirrors in some ways that academic mode, not entirely. The differences are, and I've got to be careful here not to be overly critical of industry, but it has been for me a real eye-opener when I compare what I thought industry was to what it is, at least. And again, throughout this conversation, I'm obviously talking about Microsoft, my own experience in a very large company. It's different in other companies, but it's a generalization. But for the most part, most people in industry don't read what was done in 1975. It's about what's in front of you now, and it doesn't really matter whether that has been really well thought out or not. And that was, for me, striking, the difference that there wasn't this body of work that underpinned this strategy, where people really could derive from first principles the motivation for what they're now going to put very large amounts of money in. It wasn't like that at all. It was more like, well, that's a nice slide deck and it seems like a reasonable thing and you've been successful before, critical aspect, so let's go for it. And if it doesn't work, we'll kill it and move on to the next thing. And that's often the rhythm of it. And, that's the way in which they filter success from failure is chop and change and move around. And I've seen that a number of times. But yeah, the idea that you would read a paper. On the academic side, of course, it's the idea that anyone would read the paper you're writing. Equally, this role of publication, I think, is a thorny one on both sides.
Yeah, thank you. I think me having been in industry, I definitely relate to what you're saying, whether it's well thought out or not. I've worked with Nico in the past and his team, and they'll give me a number like it's 86.7. Oh no, I'm sorry, it was actually 86.5. I'll be like, you're saying it's between 85 and 90. And we don't care the preciseness. John, what's your view?
There's a lot of things that make sense there. I'm going to focus a little bit on some differences. In academia, you're taking on students, and then over time, they know what they're doing. And by the time you're working on your final experiment, you just kind of leave the students alone so that they can do it all on their own. And that's kind of the progression. So you're mentoring a lot at the beginning, and then you're talking about very high level concepts at the end. In industry, these are people who are expert in what they're doing already. They don't need any training, and generally, and you're just kind of talking over the high level concepts and where things are going on, and thus it's different. But it's kind of nice because people are well trained, they know what they're doing, so they can take on a lot of responsibility by yourself, and then you're more talking about some of the high level concepts, and we're covering that. It's a natural evolution. My feeling in industry is that you're trying to get to a goal, you're trying to build something. In the end, you have to build something that people want to buy, and that's like really hard to do. Okay, in academia, all you're trying to do is getting something so you can write a paper. Okay, and since it's a higher stakes, you're trying to get it to really work, trying to make it useful, trying to make it so people want it. It's a much harder thing to do. Of course, you have trained people, and then you're just kind of more guiding as a leader. You're more guiding to make sure that people are kind of doing the right things and going in the right direction to do that.
Thank you. So in your answer, there's, the team required to take a product to market is completely different than the type of team that you would need in academia. So Nico, I've got a question for you. What type of career opportunities exist in industry that us coming directly from a PhD might not think of or be aware of or be exposed to yet? That we might be suited to from with a fundamental research background.
So I'm taking, of course, my anecdotal example as to answer this question. Something that I used a lot from day one when I moved to industry without really realizing until later that it was something I learned during my PhD was communicating, presenting, and managing projects. So when you, okay, I lost the camera. Oh, sorry, you're still there. So managing a project in industry is not that different from the last project that John was talking about. At the end of your PhD, you start owning what you do, you know what you're doing. And in industry, this is very valuable, especially in consulting. So I will say that aspect is something that gets ported very well. Going more into technical roles, what was very useful for me was learning to solve problems with coding, which I expect pretty much all your PhD students to be able to, and that will open access to a lot of positions of solving problems with code. I'm not talking about software engineering, but software development, data science, a bit of data analysis, all roles about all people in data analytics I've talked to worked with or supervised in the past 4 years since I left academia, they would have been way better if they did a PhD in terms of analysis skills and knowing how to get from numbers.
Great, thank you. Koy, one of the things that really struck me in your opening was that throughout your career, you've kind of seamlessly transitioned between industry and academia. One thing that's kind of striking is that, industry and academia are often framed as a dichotomy. And has that been true in your experience, or do you still feel that to be true or not true? Maybe you can comment on that. That, it's industry or academia, they're kind of like opposites of one another. Do you feel that to be true or no?
I guess to some extent. I think the examples that John and David mentioned, they are involved in industry, but they are involved in really the R&D part of the industry and the very, very pointy end of the R&D part. So if you look at the spectrum of activities that's happening in the industry, it's really, really broad. I guess my extreme example would be when I was working for Sony, we are not interested in R&D. We're interested in refining the process. And my work life was 5 full days of work. I left home at 5 because I have to take a ferry to the mainland. I got home at 9 in the evening. And 5 days, the next week would be 6 days, and then it would be back to 5, and 5, 6, 5, 6. And all that we do when we were in the factory is to just look at how to streamline the process. So I think what was mentioned here, that communication and problem-solving skills are really the 2 most important skills we could bring to any of the industry spectrum of work. If you can communicate and can solve problems, it doesn't matter about the form or Galois theory. They are all details. I think it's the adaptability that we have. So yeah, I don't think they are that different, because when you're in the lab, and when you're presenting your science paper, you also need the same 2 skills anyway.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize, you're learning by the end of your PhD how to solve problems and how to solve it quickly. And if you can do that, there's a lot of companies who will be interested in you. And of course, if you go into academia, you have to be able to do that too. And I'm going to say that as you're getting your PhD, that's a skill that you want to really focus on, feeling confident in doing that, because, well, you'll always have a job then, okay? You'll always be useful for someone, and you'll have a lot of different opportunities with that skill.
So kind of inherent in your answer, you have to be really competent. You also have to be really confident. So as academics, I was wondering, and one of the questions from the students was, do you find the need to constantly be inventing and to be on top in some sort of academic ladder? Do you find that to be stressful? David, maybe you could take that one.
I mean, for me personally, I think that's one of the things that get me up in the morning, the opportunity to immerse yourself in an idea and pursue that to the point that there may be an invention there, or you might learn something. I can see how that's stressful, but I think that for most academics, it's not like that stress is there on a daily basis. I must invent. I must, ideas come, but they also take a long time to turn into and test and turn into something. And so, I mean, one piece of advice I would give that I felt has served me really well is to have projects going in parallel that are very different. I for nearly a decade had a major effort in quantum computing, but I also had an effort in magnetic resonance imaging that was really decoupled. And it turned out there was a lot of, I think, crossover on a technical level and a lot of ideas, but having separate projects meant that when one was in a certain phase of incremental progression and doing the hard slog and failing fabrication process, there was something else broadly in the group and in the lab that was on a different time. And I think that was one nice way of balancing that stress of being creative, stress of thinking differently. And I've seen a number of academics be very successful by having that multiple projects running.
Koy, do you have to share David's strategy, or do you have your own, or do you find it hard dealing with that?
I like what David say. I think diversity in your activities is really healthy, and sometimes this leads to confluence of knowledge as well. Because then one of the projects that you're working on, which seems to be completely removed from your main project, in the end actually fits right back in. And I think a lot of the really successful company, and my examples are really old now, is, for example, 3M, when they discover Post-it pad or some of those cleaning mat that we always step into the house, those are all failures in some of the projects. But in another team looked at their solution and go, oh, your failure is actually my success. And so you can actually transport some of the finding from a failed targeted what objective into something that is a success in another part of the activity.
Switching gears a little bit, being an academic requires you guys to teach, lead a team, and do research. John, I was wondering if you consider this a feature or a bug of being in academia?
Yeah, it's a feature and a bug, I guess. There are some really wonderful things about that. Like, for example, you're waiting for your next idea, okay, and thinking about things. Teaching is really great because it's fun and people are learning, and you get intellectually involved in something, and that's great. And oftentimes you're going to be teaching something that may be peripherally related to what you're doing, and then you'll get an idea because of that. So it's just part of it. And then, of course, when you're immersed, you just got a good idea, you're trying to get it done, and teaching is horrible because it's taken away from your other exciting time. And it just kind of ebbs and flows in that way. And the nice thing is something always is going on, and you're busy, and people want your attention, and they need to talk to you for the various levels. And that's of course, very nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Nico, having stepped away from academia, I was wondering if maybe you might have a different perspective, or what do you think?
Absolutely not different. Being able to be good in different fields, even though they don't overlap, is a massive value. The three examples you put were teaching, which I associate with being able to train other people. What were the other two? Learning continuously, actually. Yeah, and managing a team. They're all skills that in my roles I had to use a lot. And I feel like, and I have the impression that they are very valuable. Being able to teach perhaps is important when somebody is managing people more than projects. And that's something that, coming from academia and coming from a PhD, will put me in a position where I knew more of specific things than the people that were in my team. And being able to communicate, teach, and upskill is of a massive value, especially the company where I work for.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just to follow a little bit further on what John was saying, I think teaching is the secret sauce in a lot of ways. Not forever, and there's a period of time to sort of step out of that usual, teaching mode. But certainly for me, that was a critical time in my career where the pressure and it forces you have to go in front of 30, 40 students and give a lecture about something. That was critically important to really understand things. And I would say, looking at what, for instance, condensed matter physics, what I knew when I took those courses in undergraduate compared to what I knew through a PhD and so on, until you teach it and teach it multiple times and think about it, it starts to become increasingly harder because you're learning more. And by the end of it, after teaching it for a number of semesters, I realized I knew absolutely nothing about the subject. It was getting worse and worse and worse. And you have to sort of stop teaching it because it starts to bother you. But so many research ideas emerged from that. And I think that is a big difference, again, to come back to industry and academia, that many people in industry haven't had that opportunity. They're brilliant at what they do, very focused at what they do, but not necessarily will you see those skills both in communication and teasing apart an idea from many different perspectives and able to bring that across and motivate that. And that is a natural skill that you learn as an academic or as a PhD in general.
And I'm just going to compliment them, say that you have to clearly articulate your ideas when you're in front of students. And that doesn't necessarily have to happen in industry, but you really should be doing that so that everyone understands things. And you learn how to do that. You learn how to organize your ideas in a proper way.
Question to start with you, Ping. I think John mentioned this briefly earlier. Well, when you're a public company, you have a fiduciary duty to your public shareholders. And when you're a private company, you typically have a fiduciary duty to your VC investors. how does it drive decisions into what research projects to take on and pursue in industry versus what to, go on a tangent and explore in academia?
You mean which part of my research I should consider commercializing?
In terms of what do you actually decide to focus on? Could it, a pet project versus something that needs to have tangible benefits in the near term?
I always think that the path towards commercialization is quite similar to bringing up a child, because there could be so many objectives, there's so many pathways, and I can only mention about my own. So to me, when I worked on quantum key distribution, we discovered that, we can get, from really the first step to the very last step, where you can convert, your laser photon statistics into signals and then into information and then finally into key. So I think to roughly answer your question, I would think that there are two things that would kind of prompt me to commercialize my research. One is when you found something that is so ubiquitous in its application that you think, if I can get this done, then immediately I have a big spectrum of people who are interested in my technology. And another is that you have something that is so specialized and so technical that you think you have an IP advantage over your competitor. So in Department of Quantum Science, we are quite proud. We are a small department. We have about 7, 8 tenured staff members, but we have spun off 4 companies. Quintessence Lab is one. And this is an example where we think, in Australia, we are the first group to have done the whole quantum key distribution from end to end. And so we think we have an advantage in terms of IP over other competitive group. But then my colleague then shared that had this FPGA skills where he can program and he can convert an FPGA into a universal instrument. So now he started Liquid Instruments. It's basically a platform that is run on iPad. You can train the black box into a spectrum analyzer, a function generator, a bandpass filters, a data logger. So if you look at this, then his IP is not unique, because anyone can play with FPGA and can program it. But because it's so universally useful, then he go, no, this isn't a commercial opportunity. I'll just be faster than the other people, because I don't have any IP advantage over people, right? But if you can go on the market really quick and then just harness the big uptake from the broad spectrum of customers, then you're in the driver's seat.
And David, John, do you have a perspective from much larger companies such as Microsoft or Google?
I'll tell you a little bit of how I view things. I have always tried to do the basic physics that are based a little bit on a device or instrumentation. And what helps me is I think, okay, we want to build a particle detector, build a quantum computer. That directs my research, and it enables me to think about what would be an important problem and what would be a relatively unimportant problem and direct it. And because there's a million questions you can ask, and this kind of directs me. So I got interested in the late 1990s in quantum computing because it's, for all the reasons people know, it's interesting. There was some funding, I get started, and it took, let's say, about 10 years to understand, well, maybe how would you build a quantum computer? And then once I did that, with of course, a lot of help and talking with people, we were then focused to research on the various things we needed to do that. And the interesting thing happened is we were making this and getting it to work. Then, Google came to me. Actually, another company came to me, and the Google was better. But we had gotten far enough along to make it industrially interesting. And then, so for me, a lot of it has just been doing things, doing it well, doing something that's interesting, and then just things will happen because of that. And then you get to choose among options what's the most interesting thing. So it's not very well planned, but it's planned in the sense you're doing, you know, you're doing good physics, you're doing good engineering, you're solving problems, and then things happen with that.
Can I?
And maybe just on the.
Sorry, there is a bit of lag.
Sure. On the question of IP, I think for the biggest companies like Microsoft, again, for me, the shock was realizing that IP in and of itself as something that was going to create value. I thought, well, industry must be interested in patents, and they must be interested in IP, and that's how they're going to make money. And it was such a, you know, naive point of view that the biggest companies care less about that, more about maybe IP and patents from the point of view of not finding themselves in a position where they're locked out of a technology, less about we're going to use this IP and run with it. I think the other aspect is when it's a company, you know, that's very large, there's a new dimension that enters where, you know, people think about, well, somebody could claim that a company like Microsoft, you know, infringed on their IP. And that's a very big company with you know, worldwide reach and a lot of money. And all of a sudden, you know, a claim from somebody that claims a big company took something from them can turn into a very big problem. And so that skews their thinking, which is really different from, I think, what Koy was saying, where you have an idea, that critical IP, you know, really leads to a business opportunity. Here it's almost the other way around. It's like, how do we ensure that we don't get locked out of something, or how do we ensure that we don't get sued because somebody thinks that we infringed on their IP? And that was, for me, you know, an eye-opener.
Yeah, I have just my experience to bring regarding projects or research projects that are interesting, but they're not. And I will be brutally honest, it's very hard to sell that to a business that acts to make money, make a profit. And even though I have a backlog of at least now 30 to 40 interesting ideas to explore, it's very hard to get the business allow me to start them if they don't have any kind of long-term value for the company. So that's something I'm really
Another quick question for you, Nico. Outside of you, I mean, obviously you're outside of academia right now. I was just curious how academics, including us PhD students, like what's the industry perspective? How are we perceived, especially when students like me don't have any experience?
Yeah, so sorry if I'm laughing, but this question just reminded me of when I moved my very first job out after a PhD. I was talking to a colleague of mine that didn't know I just finished 15 months before. And he was commenting on these new consultants who are doing a piece of work for us, saying something like, you know how academics are. And it was like, no, how are they? And I found out that, again, very anecdotal, but it's consistent to pretty much all experiences. Some kind of stigma around people that come from academia as being, what's the political, probably perfection. And as in, problem, academic, you are assumed that you will take the longest and elegant way to solve the problem instead of the short, hacky, cheap way to just address that. I've seen this over and over, and in some cases, people that came from academia didn't have this attitude. But I would expect, I don't know if it makes sense, I could try to rephrase it, but essentially the difference between solving a problem deeply in a very dirty way and solving the problem with the mindset of writing a beautiful publication around the solution and presenting it in front of peers. So the two attitudes. Does it make sense? Sorry guys, I can't see the audience, so I don't know whether I'm completely off to a tangent or not.
No, everyone's nodding.
Awesome.
Okay, David, I've got a question for you. Many academics who join industry retain their university affiliations. I was just wondering, I mean, I think, yeah, can you explain?
Yeah, great question. I mean, there's a personal answer there, but I think for this field of quantum computing, it's something that I feel very strongly about, and I'm pretty vocal within both Microsoft and also the University of Sydney, that the field is at a point where it needs both. And I think we need, you know, the kind of the muscle of industry, that focused attention, the way industry solves problems, like what John said. You know, my experience as an academic, maybe it's just me, but there were many a time where we wrote a grant or set out on a particular idea, fabricated a device, cooled it down in a dilution fridge, measured it, realized it had no chance in hell of doing the thing we set out to do. But it does something interesting, which we'll pretend was the original aim, and we'll write a nice paper about that thing. And, you know, we did that, many papers out of that style. And you can't really do that in industry. You have to deliver on the thing that you were actually trying to do. But the field is not at a place where I think we can just shut off serendipity and accidental discovery and, you know, the clueless student who intentionally goes against their supervisor and does something wild, and in doing that figures out a new path forward. We're still, you know, in that mode with this field in general, where we need, I think, deep, rich thinking, things that fall naturally to academia, as well as those aspects that come with young people, that come with people from different fields that have come, you know, with a different mind. We need that. But if we just have that alone, and we don't have the leverage and the muscle of industry, the focus, the engineering know-how, the global reach, then we also get stuck. So my job, or two jobs, is actually really challenging on a personal level, almost to the point that it's, I would say, not sustainable. I have two bosses and totally two different worlds. But I also feel the need that these type of hybrid roles also allow for both sides to continue to coexist and sort of take the best of both worlds.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story that has been repeated many times when you talk to venture capitalists. They would say, if you make a breakfast, it's bacon and egg. Both the pig and the chicken are involved, but one is really committed, the other is only involved. So as professors, I think we all want to lay eggs after eggs to kind of like, you know, okay, can this be a startup? Can this be of any use? But then you do need to have people, young people, hopefully, who are really committed and involved in getting the business going. And I think if you surf the internet, you'll find that, you know, the composition of a dream team startup that involves hipsters, hackers, housekeepers, hounds, and then you do need to assemble all of these. But I guess as an academic, we find that we are mostly hackers. We want to solve problems, and it's a personal choice whether you want to resign from your professorship or continue to play that role to complement this dream team that hopefully will be assembled for your company.
And I would say maybe 40 years ago when I was a student, it was much more a choice, either or. And now universities understand that generating local jobs and startup companies is very good for the university for a variety of reasons. And they're much more willing to do that now, which is, I think, a good sign. And you always have to work carefully how to balance both needs, as was discussed.
John, another question for you. Right now, there's obviously a lot of optimism surrounding quantum computing, that, you know, the field and quantum technology in general, that, you know, the field, it seems like things are going well, but you can't always look 10 years down the line and see what's coming. So if it turned out that there was a quantum bubble, how transferable do you think the skills that we have as quantum scientists and engineers will turn out to be?
That's an interesting question, because I'm always worried about, you know, what's going to happen to the field, and are we making enough progress to get more funding to go on. And I would say it's nice because the progress has been such that, you know, we know it's going to be okay for another 10 years, and then we'll do it. And for me, I'm going to be retired in 10 years or some equivalent. So, you know, I've made it past the finish line, more or less. So that's great. But what I think is really great about quantum technologies is that it's a hard technological problem, hard engineering problem, and you have to combine both science and engineering in a way we talk about. And that's really good training for people. So, you know, in terms of like funding it on the national level, it's exciting, you should do that, but you're going to be training people really well. And you're going to be training them to try to do something more practical. And if people go on to do other things, I think that's going to be a good experience for them.
Maybe just to add, I think there's an evolution of field, the way fields move, where there is a sweet spot in terms of the opportunity for education. And so if you look at maybe astronomy or high energy physics, you can see high energy physics move from the 50s and bubble chambers and desktop-like experiments, small, you know, setups, through to now high energy physics is in a totally different era where you're either doing data analysis as an experimentalist, or you might be building a particular aspect and working on, but it's now so large and so collaborative that that's not to say there isn't educational opportunities. Of course there are, but they're focused and they're narrow. And I think quantum computing at the moment is still at a phase where students get opportunity to learn about, you know, vacuum physics and electronics and cryogenics and mathematics and lasers and somehow that's the fun, and that I think is really the opportunity to learn about all of this different stuff. 10 years from now, you'll be a niche focused, you know, when you'll say, what do you do? Oh, I'm a quantum computing experimentalist. In what specific area, in what specific, you know, it will be very focused. But I think at the moment, it's an opportunity to take advantage of the breadth of opportunity.
So Nico, if we do end up jumping ship from academia to industry, what are how are the qualifications that we develop with academia, like publication records, scholarships, and grades? How are they valued or perceived, and how do people in industry frame their own accomplishments?
Yeah, tough question, because yeah, to be very honest, nobody really cared in the 4 or 5 companies I worked since leaving academia about my citations, conference attendance. And that was very disappointing. I was like, guys, I worked for on these. I'm so. And now you're saying that you don't even know how to. But at the same time, I found that the most valuable part of my CV was my GitHub repository. I had all the code I wrote for the different papers, open source, available, and they could see that when I said I know how to coding, that was real. That was the main accomplishment that recruiters evaluate. Yeah. That said, though, when I published a paper, because this paper went through years of reviewing process, so it's something I started and then it was handed over to the next people, but it was still part of the process. When I had to inform my company that the publication with BlueScope was coming out, there were big celebrations, the PR office, because it was something so new for what they know. Don't ask me why a manufacturing company likes the idea of having in galaxy chemistry, but that was pretty weird, but also exciting. Suddenly, a big astrophysicist in a super big steel manufacturing company. But apart from ego, absolutely nothing else.
Thanks, Koy. It seemed like you had a little chuckle when that question was asked. Do you have a?
Oh well, yeah. I don't think anyone cares about what you have published when you're working in a big company. I still come back to like your problem-solving skill, demonstrate that you have the right attitude and motivations, your personality. I think these are the things that I guess, you know, if you had an interview with Google or Microsoft or any other big companies, they focus more on those. as long as you have demonstrated high level of problem solving skill, it doesn't matter if you publish 1 paper or 10.
Let me just add one thing. You know, Google Google is known for their careful interviews, and we actually spend lots of effort trying to understand what to ask people. One of the things that we ask about is when you do your experiment, you touch a lot of technology. So if you used a vacuum system, would you know how a vacuum gauge works? Okay? Or if you used an FPGA, would you understand something about the FPGA? Because we want to hire people who are curious about technology, know how it works, you know, at a rudimentary level, but also, you know, if something were to break, do they know enough about the stream of things that they do in order to fix it? So, you know, that's an example of like really understanding what you're doing and being able to problem solve because of that.
I think continuing on with you, John, what are some of the softer skills? We'll mention communication, but what are some of the other softer skills that are important to develop during the PhD? Are there extracurricular courses people should think about just to position themselves? Because the jobs that are coming out are not necessarily always engineering. They're, you know, there are people looking for product managers with quantum experience in the future. Those people are going to need certain amount of skills. So business developers with quantum PhDs. So if for those who are thinking, you know, I'm not quite sure yet where I want to go, what are some little, you know, pieces that you'd be thinking about sort of adding to their toolbox? John, David?
Maybe I'll jump in. I guess there's 2 aspects to that, the softer skills and also the broader opportunities. I mean, huge opportunities for people that are familiar with what science and engineering is. If you've come from a PhD or you've had that experience, even if you put aside all of the technical specifics, you know how it looks and how people work and what the rhythm of it looks like. That's very valuable. A lot of people in program management positions that have to track work and prompt people and keep things somewhat on track. And a lot of that is really challenging because you're bridging different areas. Bridging in general, I mean, if you're somebody that likes to know a little bit about one area or another area and connect those worlds, I think that that's critical. I mean, the communication thing we've sort of talked a lot about. I think that is, there are many different aspects to communication. One key point that I would make is an ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and rapidly adapt the way in which you interact to be able to get your message across and communicate what you want, which is different for different audience and different for different personalities. But, you know, you're often, not a week goes by that I'm not in a position where I'm having to present or explain something to a senior executive. And how do you do that effectively? How do you do it in the minimum amount of time? That is something you can practice, and you don't need to think about managing up to higher executives, but even to your friends. What do they know? What don't they know? And how can you very effectively and quickly bring across critical ideas? That is, I think, a very important skill.
Can you add something on that?
Please do.
I mean, I agree absolutely 100%. And on top of that, the ability of telling stories. In my PhD, some courses about that because we had to present our research in a captivating way, starting from at the end and getting the audience into it. That's a soft skill that I used in my career. Taking a complex problem that my grandma would simplifying it without of the actual content and making it engaging. That's something you can use everywhere.
Thanks. Okay, well, we've got some speaker-specific questions now. Nico, while I've got you there, maybe you can take the next one. We're wondering if you could compare and contrast working at BlueScope with a startup, and which of the types of companies would you consider a softer landing when coming from a PhD?
As long as what I'm saying stays between the few of us. No, I'm joking. So I jumped from academia to startups, big corporation. And the main difference I saw is the risk appetite. As in,
Sorry, can you say that just once more? It seemed like a key part, and you just cut out just at that moment, that key moment. The main thing you saw was
is the risk appetite. As in a blue scope, big organization, a lot to lose by allowing data scientists of engineers to play with stuff. So a lot of more bureaucracy and structure and processes. Everything has to be very well from the beginning, and there is very little space for experimentation. Although we do experimentation, but it needs to be like on the beginning to the end. That has some pros. For example, where you're going to. I find, given my mindset and my attitude, is that you don't take risk, but you also take full ownership of success. Successes are partially yours, but not celebrated as a startup. Startup is the opposite. You are in a situation of life and death this time, because generally you are in a runway of, but at the same time you are given a massive responsibility and a massive ownership over what you're doing. And also in good startups like the ones where I was, a lot of independence and ownership in solving a problem. The CEO was like, this is the problem, you solve it, tell me how long you need, tell me what resources you need. Of course, we are not like swimming in gold, so don't expect too much generosity. And at the end, let me know what to do. And that kind of freedom, I miss quite a lot. Hence, flip side, a company like BlueScope has a lot of more resources. So stability, resources, those help, and you are in a much more comfortable position. So to answer your question, and sorry to digress this much, but I love the sound of my voice, as you can guess. It really depends on the attitude. If you like to be in a position where you can take full ownership of something and being independent and owning it to the end and taking also the risk of failing by yourself, startups are the best place to go. If instead you want to be in a more comfortable position where you have a massive frameworks and guidelines to tell you how to do things, you just care about getting there, corporate is excellent. Salaries are better in big companies though.
Thank you. Next one's for Koy. Quintessence Labs was Australia's first quantum startup. What did you learn about the quantum computing ecosystem and the quantum ecosystem in general by being one of the early players in this that you might not have learned otherwise?
I think the ecosystem of cybersecurity and quantum communication is at this point in time, at least, not too much coupled to the quantum computing world. So I guess in our ecosystem, what we want to do is we want to work with the information security network. So one of the challenging thing is you can't convince people to drop their encryption protocol because you got a quantum encryptor. So you got to integrate yours into that. And that takes a lot of convincing people. And also sometimes you can't just say, we want to do quantum key distribution. No one wants a one-time pad. Everyone is doing their standard PGP or AES or whatever protocol that they want. So you got to improvise a little bit. So our ecosystem is very different from the quantum computing world. And the other aspect of it is we can look at some other platform. For example, now we're looking at extending it to space, because you can transmit quantum information up, and there's already hour-long quantum memory demonstrated in Australia, and also now recently in China, where you can have 90 minutes allows the low Earth orbit satellite to travel around the world. So there is this possibility of convincing big networks and countries that you could actually have this quantum communication link that would be global. So that's our ecology of the quantum communication community.
Thank you. John, previously you've discussed two different types of personalities, the definite optimist and the indefinite optimist. Could you please just quickly summarize those for the audience, and then comment on whether you think one is better suited to academia, industry?
Thank you. I highly recommend people reading Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, about startups. And he talks specifically about these kind of personalities. And just because it's a good book on startups and thinking about your career, and he has some very nice things to say. Indefinite optimist is really kind of how the university works. It's actually the dominant way that you think probably in Australia, US, other places. Basically, we have quantum computing. Let's have a lot of people investigating it in very different ways. And then let's get the knowledge, and then something will come out of it. Okay, to put it very, Peter Thiel does a better job. Definite optimist says, you take that, but I want to work on a specific problem. I'm going to want to solve it. And it's kind of, you can think of it as the indefinite optimist is all the background knowledge that gets created, which is really important. And the definite optimists are taking some idea and saying, okay, let's make it a product. Let's really understand it, and let's go forward and really focus on that, which of course I think it's said indirectly in Peter Thiel's book. This is kind of what the startup does for you. So as an example for the quantum supremacy experiment, this was a very hard experiment. Most people thought it would take a long time to do. It was a very high risk experiment, but I promoted that quite a lot because it was very definite. And I kind of felt if we failed, we would learn something from that. They're very important. But there was some risk involved in it, and I think most people wouldn't want to do that risk. Somehow I thought it was okay. But I'm also going to say that definite optimists like myself are very rare. It's an unusual personality for people to do. It's much more how things were in the 1960s, say in the space race and the Apollo program. You have much more people like that. So it's maybe good for being in a startup, but it is kind of an unusual personality, and people tend not to understand the way I think very well. So it is a little bit challenging that way, and I have to kind of deal with learning how to explain things better based on that idea.
Thanks. Next one's for you, David. Quantum computing is only a small part of Microsoft's business. How does this inform your team's research goals and directives?
I mean, there's so much I could say on that. I think one aspect, putting myself in the shoes of a student or a younger version of myself, to be aware of that there is a reality here to the crisis of Moore's law. We've all heard of that, but across the industry, it is a force that is changing the way these large corporations really work. And to continue to make money, it is becoming increasingly challenging to remain a software company, or even a company that makes integrated circuits. The number of companies that are making integrated circuits is now squeezed down to a very small number that can compete on multiple factors. And that physics problem, if you want to call it that, engineering challenge, is driving companies to do really different things and wild things. And I think, quantum computing isn't the answer to Moore's law. We're not going to run out of real estate on a chip or something and then jump to quantum computing as the answer to all of the problems. But it does represent an investment, for instance, like a company like Microsoft, in developing people and approaches and IP and pivoting a company to now start to move on much more aggressive, challenging technology. And I think that this will be the next few decades. We'll be starting to pivot, and it's going to. I think the breakthroughs aren't going to come from the obvious. It will be investments in quantum computing that lead to insights into related technologies that provide some way forward. But I mean, yeah, it's a big company. It makes a lot of money. It has, obviously so. That does, to come to Koy's point as well, around risk and appetite for risk. There is a bit of a safety net here that a company like that can carry. One other point I would make when it comes to Microsoft, it'd be similar for Google, similar for Amazon. I think there is tremendous talent and machinery in software, machine learning, and others, other paradigms that I think have yet to really be brought to bear on quantum computing. And I think it's going to be very exciting, and it's a bridging problem when you can connect the thousands of people in one of these companies that spend their day working on ML to many of the challenges that we face. And obviously, there are examples at the moment in the community where people are thinking and writing papers about AI and quantum, but I think we're not really in that era where we can leverage that kind of software. And there's many opportunities to bridge those two worlds. To use it in a classical way, just to be clear, I mean, using techniques of machine learning in order to be able to optimize fabrication, for instance, or to be optimize device tune-up. And I think we're going to see a lot of that in the coming years. So a big company like Microsoft, that's a lot of what it does. Hopefully we can bring that to bear on quantum computing.
All right, we're going to have one more question for each of the panelists, and then we'll open up to the floor. I'll start with you, Nico. If you could give one piece of career advice to your former self, what would it be?
Be more curious, especially in academia. There were a lot of talks happening in my department for fields like that weren't my own, that I skipped in order to focus on my research, that in hindsight would have been amazingly good to attend. Because something I'm missing out of academia is that exposure to nearby or even far away fields from what you're working on. And those opportunities to learn more and expand and be a bit more broad in your knowledge, they're not that frequent, at least in the businesses I work for. So sacrificing a bit of my focus for getting a bit broader, at least during the PhD.
Koy?
I'd probably pay more attention on the constitution of my shareholding. Because I think that leads to either getting some return or not at all. But I guess apart from this, I would like to say that the advice I would give myself is that when you commercialize, you really need to give more commitment. And I think you do not underestimate the amount of work it takes to really get involved. And yeah, so that would be it.
David?
I think just realizing that everybody else doesn't know as much as you think they know, and calibrate for that. That's not to say you know everything either, but I think many young people, I would say, including myself, presume that the person that they're talking to or the CEO that they're, are somehow very knowledgeable about something. They might be very smart, doesn't mean that they're knowledgeable, and you should calibrate for that. If you're struggling to understand something, and this is true obviously in academia and industry, but critically important in industry, I think, stopping asking why and pushing for a deeper level of understanding, that seems to really be where the breakthroughs come from in strategy, in insight, in positioning, understanding what to focus on, why, and yet it's somehow lacking in nearly every conversation.
John?
Yeah, this is kind of a hard question, but I would say I think looking back at my career, I think if I would have spent more time early on career understanding how to communicate better and, let's say, improve my people skills. We go into physics not because you have excellent people skills. I think everyone understands that, and to realize that that's something you should be working on, for your career in your various positions. That would have probably helped me.
All right, thank you. What questions do we have from the floor?
Hi. When you're undertaking a research project for a corporate, quantum computer, nobody even knows whether we can make one. Like, how do the KPIs work? How do they tell if you're on track or not? Because normally I think of corporations, the KPIs are around money somehow. and in academia, they're kind of around papers. So when you're in that blend, how does it actually work?
When I joined Google, we had a plan for what we wanted to do. And of course, things got changed a lot over time. That's okay. In the end, people are not going to understand all the details. And in the end, they're going to trust the leaders that they have a vision and they have to do that. For me, I kind of understood what we had to do and what we had to build. So I always felt that we can put whatever we have to do down, but then if the corporate leaders wanted to find out more details, I could then explain it to them. That's good. The one interesting thing that at Google is we started off a fairly small group, and there were a lot of the senior leadership who were very, people who build giant data centers. And it's like, well, how in this is ever going to work? So there was some skepticism in the beginning, and that worried me. But it's also like, well, yeah, these are smart people, and they should be skeptical. And one of the reasons we did the quantum supremacy experiment was to show that a little chip this big or a little instrument could defeat a data center. You know what I mean? And that really changed a lot of people's opinions. And that's really the reason we did it. I mean, it's a good science thing, but how do you convince the leaders of the corporation who build data centers, really powerful computers, that there's any reality to what we're doing? And so that's why we focused on it. And the nice thing is when we did that, they promised Google to, turn us into a big group, and that's what's happening. So, yeah, that's fair.
Stand up, sorry, I can't see you properly. I just wanted to ask, do you think that the looming threat of commercialization when you're in industry often cuts short novel or more interesting academic ideas that could otherwise be published in academia?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, industry has a clear focus and goal of delivering around what you've signed up to do. And to sort of partly answer also the previous question, the KPI is your progress on the vision that you articulated. And you can change that vision. And it is very much about your ability to tell that convincing narrative around what that vision is and why it's important. And thinking of examples, doing work to show and make that point is critical. But then measuring your progress towards that goal. Along the way, there are many examples of that I can think of where, as an academic, you would almost be sort of crazy not to pursue. But they really take you off a different track that you can't afford. With certain finite resources and a clear directive to deliver around what we said we were going to do, you can't really do that. One way I've personally sort of managed that I don't know, those feelings is to write patents. There's nothing stopping you writing a patent on that idea, and at least map it out how you think it should go, and file that away. And there's some satisfaction in doing that, even though you don't directly pursue it. There are opportunities if it's really compelling. I do know people, not myself, that have realized something and said, I think this is critically important. Someone needs to pursue it. I'm going to go and do that. And in very big companies, there are opportunities often for people to do that as well.
I wanted to add something. I've been thinking a lot, very much about systems engineering on these big quantum computers. And quantum system engineering, I have a video, whatever. But what happens is, if you really want to build something this complex with hundreds and hundreds of people, you have to understand the physics super well. Okay, so it is an opportunity to go in to every component of our system and understand it either as an engineering or a scientific level, way deeper than we're going right now. So I actually think it's interest. Now, it's not going to be the kind of problems that academia will look at, but they are still interesting problems, and it's going to help the technology. So I kind of think it's different, but it's still doing it. The other thing is, if we can build a quantum computer and make it useful and make money off of it, we're going to build a brand new field. There's going to be students. There's going to be more funding in the field to feed students into this, et cetera. And it's going to expand what we can do and expand what people can look at academically. So, that's kind of my goal. My definite optimist is, okay, how do we go ahead and make this thing work? And then it's going to be good for everyone in ways we can't even imagine.
So the next question comes from Zoom. They were asking about how, we've spoken a lot about how people can blend academia and industry, and they're wondering if, as a theorist, if similar opportunities apply. Have you seen theorists successfully transition between the two, or yep?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. Certainly for Microsoft's program, it was started by a Fields medalist, mathematician Michael Friedman, who understood at a very deep level, obviously, aspects of topology. Didn't know how to turn that into a technology, but in companies like Microsoft, absolutely, it's theory heavy, and there are a lot of really brilliant people, and a realization that very new ground is sort of broken by theoretical insight. And I think it's in part maybe a question of scale. It's probably harder for startup companies to be deeply skewed in theory, although in quantum computing, you see a lot more of that because it's so cutting edge and reliant on new insights and theoretical underpinning. So yeah, I think there's problem solving skills again, but even direct application of theoretical ideas in this field are needed as well.
All right, I think we've come towards the end of our session. I think in wrapping things up, I'll just share some quick thoughts. Success, I guess, in unlocking the potential of quantum science or commercializing quantum science is clearly going to involve the successful partnership between industry and academia. I think we're all aware of that. As we see in all industries, the best performing teams are cognitive diverse. And so how do we build these successful teams, perhaps rather than successful individuals? And how do we provide the environments that are supportive of the advancement and execution of these great ideas that are bubbling up everywhere? Well, I think the fact that I think the future generation are here tonight, and that we have such a great turnout, and that you're here to better understand the two worlds, academia and industry, I think is a great sign. Tonight we've compared and contrasted the two. And tonight's panel was titled Academia versus Industry. But what we're all are really talking about here is academia and industry. A future where you're not switching in and out between the two, where you're not giving up or jumping ship, but really where you're seamlessly operating with a cognitive diverse team that consists of business savvy professionals, great scientific minds, and smooth operators that are all contributing their expertise and skill set to build something that is bringing a lot of value and benefit to society. I want to say a big thank you to you, our audience, both here in person and on Zoom. You've been a great listener. And on behalf of Wyatt and me, SQA, and the broader Sydney quantum community, we express our sincere gratitude and thanks to our fantastic panel tonight. We do appreciate all the time that you've taken, coming quite a far way tonight to be here with us tonight. And so let's all give a big round of applause.